Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes.
So, good afternoon, good evening, and good, well, just to say something, it's diluviating here in Madrid. I'm very thankful for your company here this afternoon during our seminar. I welcome both those who are physically here in the room with us, as well as those who are following us over the internet. I'm going to give a brief introduction, then I'll introduce our speaker of today, and also the seminar, and we will then speak in German, which will be translated to English and to Spanish. In this seminar, we have talked about the culture of freedom and its threats. Today, we are dealing with a topic that has a somewhat enigmatic title, Science and Democracy, as if science was yet another threat to democracies, which at first sight seems absurd. So let's start by clarifying a few concepts. First of all, it should be pointed out that initially we won't focus on science in the strict sense of the word, but rather on what is called expert knowledge, expertise, and its increasing relevance in the public discourse. Some go so far as to say that we are already moving into an epistemocracy, that we are increasingly delegating issues that should be the subject of a general discussion to a small group of experts. The second observation concerns the difficult relationship between truth and democracy. Democracy, according to Sartori's definition, is the rule of opinion, which automatically excludes any claim to truth in an emphatic sense. We could also quote Hannah Arendt, who argues that one of the defining traits of the truth and democracy is that you can go to war about it, or that truth and democracy can be of a despotic nature. However, and this would be the third point, it seems to be clear how important scientific knowledge has become during the pandemic and in any discussion about climate change. We will discuss these and other questions with Thea Dorn this afternoon. She is a very well-known philosopher and writer, a German writer. She has been a professor of university in the Free University of Berlin, but what she has done above all is to write about almost everything in all sorts of genres. In theater, she's written scripts for television series and has won awards for both of those, and obviously also novels, essays, and so on. But apart from all that, she is a person who is very present in the German public space. She loves to argue, she loves to debate, that's why we've brought her here. And she is a representative for something that we've left aside in this seminar, but which is really obligatory, and that is that we should talk about the public space, the public debate, what we have actually been exercising here during these last weeks. She is also very well known because she has been a moderator of a very well-known television program on philosophy in the German television, and she is omnipresent in some of the most prestigious German talk shows. So very welcome to Madrid. It is a real pleasure for us to have you here with us. So let's start with a general consideration of the role of expertise. Many people have the impression that the public discourse is caught up in a dilemma between the growing influence of experts, technocrats, what we could call the infantry of system politics on the one side, and a very visceral reaction to this on the other hand, often based on emotions and simplistic explanations of complex political problems. In other words, They think we are faced with the confrontation between technocracy and populism. Among the technocrats, there are those who are in favor of depoliticizing government politics by putting any criticism of the system and the prevailing patterns of government through the filter of what is feasible or unfeasible. This argument of this is the way it is or this is not viable is one of the most discouraging statements for a Democrat. The two main sources of this technocratic view of politics are, of course, Europeanization on the one hand side and the submission to economic and neoliberalism of deregulated markets. Preventing people from imagining that things could be different is the most anti-democratic attitude imaginable. Many of these alleged constraints on political action are based on personal or partisan interests, but they are sustained by referring to the irrefutable argument of expertise. Habermas, long before globalization really got going, in the 70s already, I think, already talked about technology and science as an ideology. The reaction to this situation was not long in coming. Populist movements or parties were the first to make an appearance. Since then, both phenomena, technocracy and populism, have entered into a dialectical relationship. The greater the technocracy, the greater the incentive to undermine it by empowering the lower classes or the people in the face of what increasingly appears to be a de facto grand coalition between the major parties. Contributing to this is the perception that the political elites have distanced themselves from their electorate by becoming a professional class with its own goals and interests, well guarded by the Praetorian Guard of expert knowledge. Populism is thus an expression of displeasure at the impotence of politics and the autism and technocratic arrogance of the elites. But in both technocratic and populist models of politics, representation and thus parties would lose much of their meaning. They are the two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, there is technocracy that excludes any alternative to a certain decision by defining this decision as necessary. The pluralism of options is diluted by the fact that the technical rationale becomes the main argument to justify any decision. Technocracy also questions the representativeness of the political parties, arguing that they attend to short-term interests of the public opinion and not to that great general interest that can only be grasped by rational methods. And the other one, the populism, on the other hand, presents itself as the only one capable to connect with the true interests of the people, of reversing a situation, or, to put it another way, to transforming what liberalism sees as a motley collection of pluralist interests into a single popular will. The authority that some claim for the experts, the others attribute to a leader, and both question the authority of the parties on the grounds that political parties only represent themselves and forget about the real problems of the people. In other words, both visions show a dangerous trend towards unity and the elimination of pluralism and intermediary actors. What do you think? Do you think this diagnosis is correct? And then the next observations are going to be much shorter. Dear Fernando Vallespin, thank you very, very much in the first place for the invitation and also for this introduction that makes us really think. I think you have described the situation in a very precise way, the technocracy with growing importance, and on the other hand, another populism, the populism more and more irrational. Both the concepts that came to mind immediately, and I think Tony Blair was the first to start talking about this. He said there is no economic policies of the right or the wing, only good or bad ones. That's already a first step in that direction, and that has become this has become a coined expression. And the German Chancellor, during her 16 years of mandate, was a great defender of there is no alternative, TNA, and she has often quoted this. Well, this, of course, opens up the following situation, because if something is, there's lack of any alternative, that means that the others have got nothing to say. And this is where populists start their arguing, and the German right-wing party is called precisely Alternative for Germany. But if you allow, I would like to take a step back and ask myself what it is that we mean by technocracy, because I think not without exaggerating, we can affirm that we are already living in a technocratic world, not that we are governed by it, but obviously, our world is technocratic in the sense that most of us also the extreme right relies on technology. Technology surrounds us in our daily life, and we all, without exception, rely on it, be we members of the left or the right. We all rely on medicine or nuclear plants to function in the way that scientists have designed them and that they have then been built. And then if we take another huge step back, we can ask ourselves, how did this come about? What need was it that this high degree of technology has tried to serve? And there we come to the very trivial conclusion that the human being was facing a very wild nature where he alone didn't have very good chances of surviving. He couldn't fly, he can't swim, not too well, doesn't have big teeth. So the humans started to invent things, exploring nature, and has started to modify the world to adapt it to his own needs, like no other animal can do. No other animal can develop the capacities in the way the human beings have done. And now we come to an important concept which also Habermas has already referred to, and that is that in the early human phases, the idea that a human being would be able to change the natural course of things in such a way that things would go better way for him, so that a disease would not have to be endured, but that there would be a remedy. And that was connected to religion, to magic, to priests, the prayers, the rituals, the temples, and so on. Well, they represented the first step by which human beings try to intervene in the course of the development. This role, well, the church and religion have lost their importance because human beings have realized that there are more efficient methods to fight diseases, like vaccines, for example, much more efficient than drumming or than to pray to a god. So something came into existence, and that is a very powerful triangle that represents the progress of our Western world and the whole civilization. And this triangle is composed of the natural sciences on the one hand side, more and more specialized, and that get to know the mechanisms of nature up to the smallest details. And then the second pillar is technology. Initially, there was no real relationships between those two fields, but at the beginning of the modern era, the findings of natural sciences and the technical inventions are closely linked to each other. So there is not only an exploration of nature, but there is system to it, and industrialization is the next step. The industry now is able to provide the technical instruments to dominate nature, and they are being produced as mass production. And now, little by little, we arrive at the role of democracy. It's very interesting to observe that at the same time, when all these inventions are taking place, and when it is clear that human beings are not exposed hopelessly to the events of nature, and he does not have to rely on priests and their connection to God, but human beings have realized that the scientists, the technicians, and the industry can play a much more efficient role. So this powerful triangle of progress and the concept of democracy. And how is that exactly related? And what is the sense that underpins this technocratic model of the world? And we could say it is something like a maximization of usefulness. We human beings, we want to live as long as possible, as comfortably as possible. That was initially difficult for all human beings, but there's always been an enormous difference between the rich and the poor. In the old days, also an emperor would die much earlier than we die nowadays, but he would die much later than the poor. So this idea that a human being wants to live in a mostly comfortable way, as healthy as possible and as long as possible. This concept is being democratized by claiming this as a right for all. And this creates a tension between this thought and the democracy, in the sense that everyone should be able to define what happiness is for each other. During the pandemic, we have seen that health suddenly became an absolute value. One thing that I really found overwhelming during the pandemic was that we permitted people to die alone in order to avoid the propagation of the disease, which is very rational, but which is not very ethical. For those who were ill or were dying of whatever reason, to be left alone, to be secluded, to be locked up, that was something it was impossible to discuss publicly in Germany. There was this imperative, we have to do this without any alternative. And I think this is something we will have to talk about. Is there something like a materialistic core to this technocratic view of the world? Is the type of human being really this being that is very disciplined, very practical, not prepared to accept destiny, but on the other hand, it submits to science, to rules that scientists impose. And the basic democratic question is, where is this well-being, this happiness for everyone? And it looks like, at least for the time being, this is being pushed back. Well, maybe just to start with this, we'll talk about populism maybe a little bit later. For me, it was important to recall this history of technocracy, because that helps us understand why it's so important nowadays and why it is something that seems so logical nowadays and seems to explain why we are where we are. When you started to reply, I suddenly had to think of Max Weber, the demystification of the world through science. And don't you think that this triangle also has contributed to this demystification of social life? The old Max Weber has said this in other terms. And this is something that populism has been trying all the time. We need politics to enchant us again, to be something that produces emotions around it. And I think there is an interesting thought. And the reaction against this is maybe an effect of this hyper-rationalization. But well, I've written a book about German Romanticism, which was the first counter movement that wanted to create new emotions, went back to the Middle Ages, looking for fables and fairy tales, but also produced anti-Semitism. This was a first sign how this opposition to rationalism can very easily turn into something very ugly. And I think this problem about re-enchanting and re-mystification is that religion has tried to do that but wasn't able to. And in this sense, we are not able. This triangle, science, technology, and industry cannot be undone, or we cannot add these emotions to it. During the pandemic, there was so much criticism of the experts, but once people are in hospital, they do want medicos to treat them with everything modern science can provide. There are some exceptions. Maybe we get to talk about them in Germany. We have a much lower vaccination rate than you have in Spain, which probably has something to do with this romantic tradition in Germany. Well, there'll be a question about it. Well, but then maybe one more word about this difference. I think that this mystification is not so much the point. What we have lost is idealism. What we have lost in this technocratic world is exactly the idealist who says, well, the sense of life cannot be only for me to live as long and comfortably as possible. That cannot be all to it. And so idealism can go two ways. I'll simplify, say, to the left. A left-wing idealist would aim for social justice, for idealism in the sense of saying, well, this is more than just living longer and more comfortable. So not reducing life to something as simplistic as that. Simply aspiring to satisfy all material needs. And the only injustice is that not all of the people can enjoy that. Well, this is an idealism which shows solidarity with human beings, but still does not go beyond the materialistic values. And then we've got the idealists of the right, or populists, and then we come to honor fatherland, the nation. These are suddenly values to the backdrop of which, the single life is worth nothing, as we see in Ukraine and Putin right now. And there is a concept that comes from the Greek language, thymus, which describes the ethics of the heroes of the antiquity. Platon, for example, the opposite to this materialistic striving for comfort. No, these are the heroes who pay no attention to their own lives, who are prepared to die for their ideals. And this is what the right-wing ideologists are now promoting. I don't know the Spanish version of it, but after what I've seen in Germany, or let alone Trump, well, they are really, I think, heroes only through their mouth, only talking. I can't believe that they would really be prepared to die for their values. But the danger is that these ideals are being occupied by the right. Well, let's concentrate on the representatives of science. Here, too, of course, we are dealing with experts, but in this case, they are endowed with the authority of natural sciences and not that of the social sciences. Here, too, we find an apparent paradox. On the one hand, science is respected and exercises an unquestioned authority. But on the other hand, it is shamelessly refuted in public by representatives of conspiracy theories, or what they call in Germany Querdenker. The pandemic is a good example of this. There we saw how the scientific discussion was taken up in a variety of opinion analysis that helped blur the lines between what was opinion and what we actually knew about the virus and how to combat it through expert knowledge. The fact that all scientific evidence is by definition refutable, and that the coronavirus was studied in real time, contributed to questioning the authority of science. That made it clear how difficult it is to define the scientific facts that are able to underpin political measures in a sustainable way, and that it is not simply a matter of translating facts into political decisions. There is a pronounced contrast between the firmness and rigidity of scientific hypothesis and the softness or flexibility of opinion makers. Indeed, during these last years, it has been fascinating to watch how easily scientific discussions in the public sphere can coincide with conspiracy theories, or how positions based on scientific evidence are vulnerable to confrontation with what are mere opinions that dispute it. Watching the odd couple, Dr. Fauci and Mr. Trump, who both belonged to the same government and yet were so different in their assessment of the phenomenon, is a good example. Or the great footage of the press conference where US President Trump explained the merits of disinfectants to combat the virus, while his experts just stared in disbelief. The lesson we can draw from this experience is the difficulty of imposing objective constraints on opinions, be they scientific or moral, which in the democratic debating culture unfold almost by default. This may be more or less regrettable, but it is a fact. Don't you think? And to what extent can that become an obstacle to a rational discussion about the challenges ahead? I think the main problem is that we find it so difficult to make a difference between justified doubts and the science. Actually, the system makes justified doubt systematic, and where alternative myth is being created, which has got nothing to do with justifiable doubts, but only has to do with too much with power. These people say, well, the experts have got too much power, so we invent something crazy to counteract. But for me, things really get complicated the moment when the science, after having been provoked by somebody like Trump, they also establish some ideological barricades. And there are things where, for example, in the study of the virus, they were working in real time and they had more questions than answer. But even under these circumstances, they also tended to claim that they had the knowledge already. And so that is as irrational as the irrational theories of the conspiracy defenders. There are two American philosophers, scientific philosophers, who in the 90s have tried to develop a concept called postnormal science, Funtovich and Jerome Ravitch. What do they mean by that? Well, they mean that there are situations, for example, in climate change and also in the pandemia situations, where the graph has got two axes. One says that there is a lot at stake, and on the other axis we have the uncertainty. And that makes that the normal speed with which science normally works, establishing hypotheses, discarding them, then examining them, well, the urgency doesn't allow science to work that way, but creates an enormous pressure. And that's dangerous, because now science reacts to that, claiming truths where the sustaining arguments are not yet fully there. And then, of course, they get criticized. The media say, well, yesterday you said this, today you said that, so what is it? And that is really dangerous. Our most famous virologist in Germany, Christian Drosten, is exactly in that situation. And it's interesting to observe how he is being discussed in public. He's got a very interesting podcast since March 2020, and during this podcast, he explains things in a very calm and very clear way. It's like inviting people into his laboratory, explaining exactly what we know, what we don't know, whether there are arguments to suppose that such and such a development will take place or not, all worded very carefully, as any good scientist would do. But as the pressure by the press got harder and harder, particularly of the yellow press. So even this very reasonable scientist started to state things as facts, where 2 weeks before he still had said he wasn't sure. And that is really a danger. So this game, irrationalists like a Trump, they want to discredit science as a whole, and science now tries to defend itself, hardening themselves and stating as facts things that they can't yet prove. And that creates this very strange situation where it is said, well, we have to be entitled to criticize scientific discourse. We have to be authorized to say, well, dear scientists, in Germany, for example, you have to wear the PP2 masks when I walk through a restaurant, but when I sit next to my neighbor at the table, I can take it off. So somebody has to explain whether this is rational. And if I ask the question whether that is rational, so if then the answer is, I know because I'm scientist, well, then something is going wrong. So there is this very urgent plea. We have to learn the following. Because what's the problem? There is a lot of anxiety, and when people are afraid, they look for someone who tells them, I know the solution. Before, those were the priests, and it's very hard to accept that maybe there is no clear path to the solution. Well, vaccinations looked like the solution to the pandemic. Well, it is making things easier, but it is not the promised solution, and we must learn to accept that. And then there is the question, who in a society finds a language with which he can reassure people, but without promising them false solutions. I really wonder whether the new government will be more lucky there than the government before. I don't know. Well, in this context, there is a point that I'm particularly concerned about, and that is the design of today's public space. Social networks and all the distortions they entail lead to considerable disruptions in the evaluation of issues of public interest. I refer, obviously, to what has been labeled as tribal epistemology, the tendency to only trust the information provided by one's own peer group, or I also refer to the proliferation of fake news, of alternative facts, of the hypermoralization of the political debate, which confuses moral principles with what are simple opinions. I also refer to how emotional arguments take precedence over cognitive ones, as if the ability to attract attention was necessarily linked to the emotional nature of the debate. What I'm trying to say is that I'm concerned about the trivialization of many issues that would require a more detailed approach. And here we should put climate change first because of its urgency. I have the impression that in this respect, Germany is more advanced than Spain, probably due to a lesser degree of political polarization in Germany, as well as to the very good quality of the talk shows on the public television, whereas these programs here in Spain mainly aim at entertaining. But what surprised me, on the other hand, is that in Germany, during the pandemic, a lot of airspace was given to those who disagreed or were skeptical about compulsory vaccination. In our country, they were hardly paid any attention to. We all followed experts' guidelines, which were approved by the authorities, and we did so without grumbling. I think this is an interesting question because it brings to the fore an important dimension, namely the need to respect opinions that rebel against the imposition of a single mainstream concept. In this case, is the one that was underpinned by scientific data. Obviously, with the proviso that this respect for these opinions, unlike in the case of conspiracy theories, will be based on the exchange of arguments backed by reasons that are supposed by evidence. I refer to, for example, these talks between David Precht, and in an interview, he said that he was not going to vaccinate his children. And there was a scandal around that. So in Spain, nobody would have said that publicly, that to start with. But he dared do that. That I find is a good thing. And if someone had said that, there wouldn't have been a big public debate about it. But in Germany, there was, and a lot. Well, I read, and I read German press on a daily basis, and so what I could see is that there was a lot of debate about compulsory vaccination, and not here. Why? Do you have an answer? Well, it is very, very interesting, because in these last months I have spent no little time on this with colleagues who think a bit alike, to complain that we are not debating anymore in Germany. Well, in Spain it's even less. Well, if from a Spanish perspective you've got the impression that we live in a debating paradise, that surprises me. Well, the case that you mentioned, and a colleague that I really appreciate very much, another philosopher and a media person, and that took place more or less at the same time as the talk show with this Mr. Precht, and she also had said simply that it is not intelligent to criminalize opponents to vaccination. She didn't even oppose herself. She just said it's not intelligent to criminalize them. Well, the consequence was that, well, that was published, and not only a shitstorm in the social media, but also the serious newspapers accused this colleague of lacking in debating culture. So in Germany, obviously, there are still some very obstinate minds who say, well, but I know of a few of them that they now, well, it's certainly nothing can't be compared to what opponents risk in places like Russia. But, well, you have to be prepared to take a real social storm if you defend an opinion that is not popular, that's not the majority opinion. For example, when the first vaccines were introduced for children, and to then say, well, let's wait, it's not yet safe for children. Well, thank God there are groups, there are circles where a reasonable discussion about all that is possible. But as soon as it is a television talk show, or let alone social media, I wouldn't say that we have a real debating culture in Germany. But very quickly, when somebody opposes a mainstream opinion, there are very quickly calls for him to be removed from the public scene. We have a very well-known scientist, special specialist on virology, and he is internationally super well renowned. But from the start, he was one to say we will never defeat this virus. We will learn to live with it. There are real debates about whether he is entitled to still talk in public television, because they say this is not a real scientist. And I really ask myself, how can any talk show journalist dare call this person a not real scientist? On what grounds? And on top of it, it looks like he was right, at least for the time being. Well, for months, he was banned from the media. It's true that he then also, under the pressure, committed a few mistakes. But initially, he simply had another opinion and had the scientific arguments to sustain it. Well, if you tell me in Spain this is much worse, then I go back and will say, oh, thank God we are not in the worst of all situations. You need a thick skin, that's all. So it looks like we still have some debating culture. Well, it's not as bad as in Italy, but we've also had a slight Berlusconi-like revolution, like Telecinque here in Spain as well. And things just stayed like that. Well, one last observation about democracy and truth, and its link to expertise. In principle, expertise would only be a means available to politicians to achieve the goals they seek. It would help them grasp problems and find ways to solve them. Expert knowledge, science of whatever kind, can only be a means and not a purpose. It cannot prescribe the actions of individuals or a society, only the scope of the action. Just as there is no scientific creation of meaning that should be left to the world of symbolic social interaction, there is no scientific orientation of society. The objectives that a society sets itself are the result of political decisions in accordance with the values and preferences that emerge from electoral processes and public debates, and not of the experts' opinions. Their role is to illuminate the field of possibilities for collective action, but the final decisions rest with the citizens and their representatives. This, at least, is what the theory of democratic legitimacy dictates. But if there is a right or necessary answer to a problem, why subject it to a democratic decision? We can decide, for example, whether or not it is worth maintaining nuclear power plants after being informed by experts about the risks they pose and the price of alternative energy sources. However, the final decision does not rest with them, but with the citizens, who are in a position to weigh the broader social costs and benefits of one option or the other. From a normative point of view, this would be desirable. But do you think we actually find this in real politics? Well, that's a very difficult point. And I think that is related to my long answer to your first comment. I have the impression that this technocratic view of the world is a specific answer with regard to the sense of life. I had already said that normally the sense of life for many people is simply to live as long as possible, as comfortably as possible. That's one of the dominant answers to the question about the sense of life. And I think the situation becomes more complex due to the fact that many representatives of the right or extreme right say, no, there are other values, but they don't really mean it. They also want to live healthy and comfortably and long, or they push it away from their conscience. Many of those who are now in the range of these extreme right-wing parties. Well, I can't forget the footage of Trump's followers. One, for example, with a big poster, "Live free or die" in Hampshire, I think it was, and who were cheering Trump, and then his wife had COVID and died, and he just couldn't stop crying and said, "Well, I thought it wasn't so bad." So I think that many of those, and the same is true for climate change, many of those who say, well, there has to be another solution. And then the hedonists on the one extreme, the ones I feel most sorry for are those who really were looking for close human relationships and who really missed out. But I also had these discussions with friends who was really prepared to risk infection and disease and so on. So I think that in a subversive way, this dominant image that this long, comfortable life is very, very extended. And if that is a good description of what the sense of life should be, is very questionable. If that can be the only reason for us being on this planet, I would put a question mark behind it, but I'm self-critical enough to ask myself, what are the alternatives? And many of those who say, well, I don't care so much about my health, well, they just push it away. And because I know very, very few people, and fewer who are then really prepared to endure an early disease, and who then say, oh, I've had a good run, I've smoked 80 cigarettes a day, I knew that that wasn't healthy, I didn't care, and okay, so now that's the price I have to pay. I don't know many people who are prepared to say that. We also could observe this before the pandemic. All the discipline about a healthy lifestyle, the food and smoking, these long eras of smoking, well, also due to the fact that for a long time it wasn't well known how dangerous it was. I just read a biography of Albert Camus, who had tuberculosis and smoked 3 packages a day because the knowledge wasn't there. We didn't know how bad an idea that was. Well, this goes back to this mystic that can't be brought back. We now know that. But there is a moralization about all that, so we have to do certain things, or we are now obliged to eat healthily. It's not our own free decision anymore, so to speak. There is a moral imperative to stay healthy. And you can see that when you eat or drink something, or when you drink a little bit too much, how people look at you. Well, in America, well, if you smoke in America, you're automatically a loser. It's completely impossible. But even here, it's starting. So it's like a new inquisition, I think, the health inquisition. Yeah, there are 2 aspects. One is A very famous author in Germany, Julie C. I think about 5 years ago, she already wrote a novel called Corpus Delicti and Dystopia with the health dictatorship. And the contract between the society and the people is the following. In this dystopia, the state grants the best possible health care. So this is what the state commits to, and so the citizens in exchange have to commit to stop doing anything that could jeopardize health. So I think this is a very clever novel. The dilemma we find ourselves in Germany. We probably have one of the best healthcare systems in the world, and we are very thankful for it. But at the same time, we realize that something isn't really working. So on the one, we can't say on the one hand side, I do what I want with my health, and that then the healthcare system will look after me. So that's the rational dilemma on the one hand side, and on the other hand, how to call it. A certain type of people who is nearly a caricature of the neoliberal self-optimizer who who really disregards anything that doesn't contribute to his optimization. So a social contract is what you're talking about. But what you say that nowadays you're nearly you're a loser if you smoke, not somebody who's just jeopardizing health, even if you avoid contributing to other people's passive smoking. So even if you sit alone on a park bench and smoke, you are considered a morally bad person. And of course, there is the argument that you become a potential client for the healthcare systems. But anyway, I'm not a psychologist. All I can do is speculate. So when I see the people in Berlin who run in the parks with their fitness tracker, who only eat green cabbage and super healthy food, when then suddenly you see somebody next to them who smokes a fag and who has a banana split and an ice cream or a beautiful bratwurst. So, yeah. That is a little bit similar to the religious ascets in the old times who looked down on people who were not holy as they were themselves, the hedonists. So there is a certain tradition in that. Well, we are coming to the end, and I've got one last question, and that's a very short question. I'm aware that this question is very delicate and difficult to answer, and it takes us away from our topic, but at the moment it is almost unavoidable. How can we debate about a war of aggression in a democracy? About how can we talk about absolute evil in a society like ours? And this is a point at which we have arrived. And a few months ago, for one month ago, we couldn't have imagined it. I guess, like all of us, I feel completely helpless in front of this situation, and I can only ask questions and have few answers, because I think we're not really grasping everything that's happening there. I've just read a text of a Ukrainian author in a German newspaper who says, don't fool yourself, this is already the Third World War, this is nothing local. World wars always normally start with a concrete war. And I'm asking myself, is this too dramatic, or do I just refuse to see it? So one aspect that has made me very thoughtful, and that's immediately related to the issues we've talked about, the Western politicians, I don't know how it was here in Spain, the discourse was Putin is crazy. And all the time I asked myself that if that means that he's lost contact with the reality, that he has that his estimation of the resistance in Ukraine was so false, and then all right, we can agree that he is crazy, but the other aspect is the question why Putin still has so many followers in his own country. What Putin offers, and I've watched his speech in the stadium, what he offers is why he looks down on the Western world, or I don't know whether he plays that role, but this is what he says. These are all these softies. All they want is to live comfortably. They are not prepared to die for their country. We, the Russians, are prepared to do that. So I'm afraid that we are experiencing something that during 30 years we haven't witnessed. Maybe these Islamic self-suicides and like many, not only Fukuyama, many others hoped that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the hope that this Western view of a technocratic world and democracy that matches, and that it would be only a matter of time until this was a model for the whole world. Well, that estimation has totally failed. And here we have a Putin with a totally different course, which is bombing us back into the middle of the 20th century. And to say, no, the individual has no value. You in the West defending every individual life. And the tragedy is that he has got the power, he has got nuclear weapons. So, right now, Ukraine is being brave and fighting for its freedom, but will we be prepared to also fight for our ideals, following the logical of the materialist utilitarian person? Well, that person would say, well, let's surrender immediately, because that's the only way to avoid this murdering. But then you hear Zelensky, you hear his texts, a text which surprises us. I think most of us admire him and his speeches. These are discussions, very intense discussions in the German media. But at the same time, we're all afraid, because the only way of putting a stop to this murdering is to surrender. But then what is the price if you surrender to Putin? Well, if you want to survive, prepared to sacrifice your freedom, that would be the answer. I'm not a religious person, so I will not pray to any gods, but I really hope he has the main resources and threats for the West, but I have no idea whether in the West we would be prepared to be idealistic, and I don't know if that would be a good thing either. I really don't know. Well, thank you so much.
Gracias.
Bueno, ahora vamos a recoger algunas preguntas
I'm going to pick up a few questions out of the audience. There is one, and then a few that have come in over the internet. Yes, can you hear me? Good afternoon. I found this conversation very, very interesting. I've got two questions. I'm not quite sure how to put the first one. When you were talking about Putin's recent speech in this stadium, when he said they are not prepared to die for their ideals, but we are. And when you link that to the idealism, it is interesting because this looks like the opposition now. What is moving imperialism if it's not an idea? Putin in reality is an idealist, and what's happening in the Western world is all the opposite. Europe is adapting to a very aggressive competition between big powers. Germany has increased the defense budget. There is already the Europe of the defense. And a hyper-realistic position in front of this idealism. Would that be an answer to Putin's position, or is this a very absurd question I'm asking? And then the other question also to do with this idealism. Here in Spain, we've had a very intense debate about the sending of armament to Ukraine. We have a very idealistic left saying no to any war and opposing sending the arms. Is this not also very dangerous? To say, well, just persist with your opinion of justice, even if the world perishes in the attempt. Has that debate taken place in Germany with the left? Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen Dank für Ihre Frage.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. When I listened to you, I, of course, realized how dangerous the concept of idealism is. When in German, when you say somebody is an idealist, it initially has a positive connotation. This is somebody who not only thinks about himself and of somebody who still has ideals. And what we have to understand is how ambivalent this concept is. And I would say, well, Putin is a brutal power monger, but he has this brutal power ideal, but it is an ideal. After all, it may be a wrong, despicable ideal, but initially we have to accept that it is an ideal. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have pacifism, normally linked to the left. And this is now the maximal clash. On the one hand side, this nationalist idealism, which I don't want to be understood with a positive connotation, but there is a famous sentence from Friedrich Schiller, the life is not what is at the core of our Western civilization. To say every individual life is the highest value, and that is the basis of our democracies. And this can now be discussed in many different ways. Schiller also referred more to an idealism of freedom. There are situations where a human being has to be prepared to sacrifice himself for the ideal of freedom, like in Ukraine, well, maybe combined with nationalistic attitudes, but they're certainly very serious about the ideal of freedom. I don't know, in German, Zelensky said a very important sentence when the Americans offered him an escape from Ukraine. Well, from a rational point of view, that that would have been perfect, but he replied, no, I need ammunition, and not free lift. Well, so what happens when this pacifist idealism clashes with this brutal power idealism? What to do? In Germany, we now have a very different government that we have never had before, like a traffic light, green, yellow, and red. These are the colors of the parties. It's completely new for us. And of course, this is left liberal. It's definitely not a conservative government, but more left liberal. And it is now very surprising that we finally have left liberal government after 16 years, and that we now just in the first 100 days of their government are forced to increase the defense budget about 100%. Well, the conscription policy was, the military service was derogated by the Merkel government. Anyway, things are complicated. I have friends who define themselves as pacifists, but then I also say to them, well, if we now deny this threat through Putin, well, doesn't that mean that we then, in the last consequence, have to be prepared to what the real pacifists were prepared to do? So, all right, so if he wants to come, let him come and get us. Pacifism that is not prepared to do that, hoping that things will turn right, well, they will have to change their discourse. So there I've got a lot of skepticism there. In the left, there are big debates, and we have the so-called left party in the parliament. That's not in the government, so this party opposes this increase of the defense budget, but also among the Greens, of course, there are conflicts around this. The only thing I'm convinced about is that pacifism, that things that you can move Putin to de-escalate by not rearming himself, well, I think that would be a naive pacifism. Can't believe in that. We have spent much more time than we thought we would. Maybe we still have a few minutes. Let's see whether there is a question here in the internet. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes, there is a question I would like to ask. Very often the newspapers seem to say that science gives very clear scientific information, but when you then read on, you often see that the scientific articles are much more humble and much more moderate. So from that point of view, this despotic character of the truth Arendt talks about is only possible when there is a degree of certainty that is very rare in reality. So in reality, it's the political forces themselves who, through the experts and through the think tanks that support them, use science in their favor to legitimize their decisions. So my question would be, do you think that science fulfills this role of legitimizing political decisions? And another question is whether you think that those who take decisions of public relevance should be more honest, admitting that although there is a scientific basis, there's also an ideological component. Yeah, thank you very much for this comment and questions. Yeah, absolutely. I also think that we have a distortion of what science is. Well, a few years ago, who would have known a name of a virologist? Well, right now, in Germany, there are 5 to 10, 20 who are all well known, and they're now more famous than soccer players. So your observation that the media play a massive role, and you are very right, because the media have a certain tendency of quoting those science who word things in a very clear way, or who simplify things to make them understandable. Probably the most complex character in the new German government is our Minister of Health, who is a scientist, but he sometimes talks in such a global and simplified way that he doesn't sound like a scientist anymore. What I tried to describe, what Christian Drosten, the most famous German virologist, does in his podcast, where he really tries to explain, and where he also tries to explain the uncertainties. But if suddenly that becomes the big political scenery, there is this trend of simplifying, and the number of clicks unfortunately confirm that people are more popular when they say simple things. So if Christian Drosten in his podcast warns about certain dangers, or when he says without him there would have been 100,000 people more dead, he never said it that way, but then the media then sum it up like that, and it becomes a headline, and suddenly he has to defend himself. I really don't envy the scientists who are exposed to these situations. So if you can give me what you want, I can only tell you what I know and what is the result of my work. I cannot promise you what you want to hear. This is like when somebody gets a very bad diagnosis. I always think I prefer to hear that from a doctor who is serious, who tells me, well, we can try this and that, but I cannot guarantee anything. And these are the doctors I really trust, because, and I would not trust to another doctor, well, it's terrible what you've got, but if you do what I tell you, you'll be fine. But that is unfortunately the type of scientist. Not only it's not that bad, there are also good scientists who do a very good job in this difficult relationship with the public opinion, but there is a certain type of scientists who depict this catastrophic scenario in the first place, to then add, well, but if you follow my advice, then all will be well. And that's just not serious. Well, thank you very much. Is there any other question? Well, we have actually reached our time, so all I have to say is thank you, particularly to those of you who've come here, who've defied the weather and have shown up, but also thank you so much to all of you who followed us in the social media. So see you again next Monday. Thank you very much.